You crossed it before you knew there was a line. Not loudly, not in a moment anyone could point to. It happened while nothing seemed to be happening. While you were still showing up, still answering, still playing your part. But something closed behind you. You didn't announce it. You didn't name it. You didn't even look back to check if it was real. And that's why this feels familiar in a way you can't place. You're not here because you're searching. You're here because something already ended. Quietly, without permission. You survived a stretch of time that didn't leave marks anyone could see. No witnesses, no record. Just you, adjusting in ways you didn't fully register. You learned how to hold still while something inside you reorganized. How to keep your voice steady while pressure accumulated. How to move through days without letting the cost show. You didn't collapse, but you didn't come out the same. There was a moment, not dramatic, not cinematic, where your internal balance shifted. No realization, no clarity, just a subtle loss of urgency, a dulling of the need to react, a quiet withdrawal from something that used to pull at you. You didn't choose it, it chose you. And because there was no ceremony, no ending, no obvious before and after, you kept going as if nothing had changed. But something did. You can feel it now in the way certain things no longer reach you, in how words land and then fall flat, in how situations that once demanded a response now pass without friction. You didn't harden. You didn't detach out of bitterness. You adapted. There's a difference. You stopped giving weight to moments that couldn't carry it. Stopped feeding dynamics that required you to stay the same. Not consciously, not strategically. It happened the way breathing changes after you've been underwater too long. And if you're honest, there's a part of you that knew this would come. Not when, not how, just that one day you would move past something without realizing it had lost its hold. That day already passed. You're not standing at the beginning of anything. You're standing after. After the part where you explained yourself internally. After the phase where you tried to stay aligned with expectations that no longer fit. After the internal negotiations quietly failed. You didn't win. You didn't lose. You crossed. And now there's distance behind you that can't be retraced, not because you refuse to go back, but because the version of you that belonged there no longer exists. You can leave now if you want, but something in you knows that if you do, you'll carry this unfinished feeling with you. Not discomfort, recognition. Because once a line like this is crossed, even silently, nothing on the other side ever feels quite solid again. You didn't respond, and that decision kept charging interest. Every time something rose in you and you held it back, something else took the weight. Your jaw tightened, your breathing slowed, your posture adjusted to carry pressure no one noticed. You learned how to swallow sentences mid-formation, how to stop reactions before they reached your face, how to let moments pass without giving them what they asked for. Not because you were afraid, not because you lacked the words, because you understood, before you could explain it, that responding would cost you more than staying silent. Still, silence isn't empty. It stores things. What you didn't say didn't disappear. It stacked, it settled, it pressed inward. There were times you felt it in your chest, a density, not emotion, compression. You were present but not exposed,
engaged but not open. And from the outside, it looked like weakness. They mistook your restraint for hesitation, your patience for uncertainty, your composure for submission. You saw it in the way they leaned in, pushed a little further, spoke a little louder, as if nothing inside you was holding the line. You let that misunderstanding exist. That wasn't mercy, it wasn't strategy, it was endurance. There's a particular cost to holding yourself back when escalation would be easier. It requires constant adjustment, constant monitoring. You don't get the release, you don't get the relief of expression. You absorb instead, and absorption changes structure. Your reaction slowed not because you didn't feel, but because you felt everything at once. You became selective out of necessity. You couldn't afford to leak energy into moments that didn't deserve it. So you learned to contain, and containment takes strength that never gets credited. No one applauds the argument you didn't start. No one sees the damage you prevented by staying quiet. No one measures the discipline it takes to remain still while being tested. They only see what you didn't do, and they assume it was because you couldn't. That assumption stayed with you longer than you expected. There were nights you replayed conversations that never happened, responses perfectly formed and deliberately withheld. Not out of regret, out of awareness. You knew if you released them, something would shift in a way you couldn't reverse. So you carried it instead. And carrying something invisible for long enough changes how you move, how you listen, how you assess situations before entering them. You stopped reacting in real time. You started responding internally. By the time something reached the surface, it had already been processed, weighed, stripped of urgency. That's when people started calling you distant, not knowing distance was the only way you could maintain control. Because retaliation would have been easy, immediate, satisfying. But easy things don't stay contained. You understood that once you gave voice to certain reactions, you'd have to live with their consequences. Silence demanded more of you, more restraint, more internal negotiation. It required you to become solid enough to hold pressure without cracking. And you did. Not because you wanted to be strong, because there was no alternative that didn't cost you more. So you learned to carry weight quietly, to let tension exist without expression, to remain steady while others mistook stillness for absence. That cost didn't show, but it accumulated, and it's part of why you're standing where you are now, with less urgency, less need to respond, and a structure inside you that wasn't there before. You paid for this composure in advance, whether anyone noticed or not.
You let it go when it looked like you were supposed to fight. Not because you were overwhelmed, not because you ran out of strength, because you saw where it was leading. There were moments when responding would have been easy, almost automatic. The words were there, the reactions ready. You felt them rise, clear, sharp, and you didn't use them. From the outside, it read as loss, as backing down, as giving ground. They filled in the silence with their own conclusions. You saw that too. You watched how quickly restraint gets misread, how quickly stillness gets labeled as defeat, and you let that story stand. That wasn't resignation, it was selection. You didn't engage because engagement would have kept you inside something you were already stepping out of. You could feel it, Every response would have pulled you back into a loop you'd already outgrown. Every defense would have required you to keep explaining a position you no longer occupied. So you withdrew, not dramatically, not with finality, just enough to change the shape of things. You didn't announce your exit. You didn't close doors. You stopped feeding the mechanism. That looked like losing, especially to those who needed reaction to confirm relevance. They expected escalation. They waited for friction. They assumed silence meant you were cornered. What they didn't see was the calculation underneath. You weren't stepping away because you couldn't hold your ground. You were stepping away because the ground no longer mattered. There's a difference between surrender and disengagement. One collapses, the other repositions. You felt the shift before it made sense, a moment where staying involved would have required you to compromise something internal, not values, alignment. You chose to preserve structure over appearance. That choice cost you in the short term. You watched influence transfer. You watched narratives move without correction. You watched control leave the surface of things, and you didn't interfere. Not because you were unaware, because you were ahead. You saw how continuing to play would lock you into a role you were already dissolving. So you allowed the loss to register. You allowed the optics to skew. You allowed others to believe you had misjudged, misstepped, fallen behind. It bought you distance. Distance creates leverage that noise never does. While they were reacting to what they thought had happened, you were adjusting to what actually had. You weren't wounded, you were clearing space. This wasn't a sacrifice, it was a narrowing. You removed yourself from outcomes that required emotional maintenance. You stopped correcting misunderstandings that only existed to keep you engaged. That's when it became obvious, quietly, that what you lost was never the point. You didn't give up power, you stopped displaying it. And that distinction matters, because once power no longer needs to be seen, it stops being negotiable. They thought the silence meant collapse. You knew it was containment. You didn't lose. You repositioned without asking permission, and the moment passed without ceremony, which is exactly how you needed it to. They expected a reaction from you. They waited for the moment your voice would change, for the shift in posture, for the sentence that would turn tension into noise. It never came. You could feel the setup before it happened, the pause designed to pull something out of you, the pressure placed just precisely enough to invite a response. You saw it, and you didn't step into it. That was the moment the conflict dissolved before it existed. There were supposed to be arguments, explanations, emotional displays that would justify escalation. They expected you to defend a position, clarify intent, correct assumptions that weren't yours to manage. You stayed still, not frozen, not absent, present, contained. Every non-response removed a lever they thought they had. Every pause shortened the reach of their influence. You denied them friction, and friction is what turns tension into control. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't sharpen your words. You didn't bring heat to something that needed fuel to survive. You let the fire remain unlit. That restraint was mistaken for uncertainty. They leaned in, believing you were holding back because you didn't know what to do next, because you were overwhelmed, because you were outmatched. You didn't correct them. Inside, something else was happening. While they prepared for confrontation, you were regulating pressure. While they anticipated reaction, you were managing impulse. You felt the force available to you, the ability to escalate, disrupt, dominate the moment, and you kept it sheathed. That choice required precision. It takes effort to hold force without expressing it, to remain composed when engagement would provide immediate relief. You didn't choose the relief, you chose control. The real conflict wasn't external, it never was. It was the internal negotiation, whether to spend energy proving something or to preserve structure by withholding it. You felt the pull to resolve things publicly, to close loops, to restore balance through explanation, and you resisted it. Not out of indifference, out of awareness. You understood that once you entered the exchange, you'd be bound by its rules. Rules designed by those who needed reaction to feel powerful. So you stepped out of the frame. What remained was chaos without direction. Their expectations collapsed inward. Their attempts to provoke lost momentum. Without opposition, there was nothing to push against. You watched the situation lose coherence, not with satisfaction, with distance. That's when it became clear that restraint doesn't look like strength from the outside. It looks like absence. But absence is only weakness if there's nothing behind it. In your case, there was containment, a deliberate holding back of capacity. You weren't avoiding conflict, you were preventing misalignment. Every withheld reaction conserved clarity. Every quiet moment maintained order. And the war everyone anticipated never happened. Not because you were unwilling, because you were uninterested. You didn't need to demonstrate capability. You already knew it was there. The real work was keeping it under control. That discipline changed the dynamic without announcement, without spectacle. They lost access without understanding how, and you remained unchanged on the surface, while internally something settled into place. Not victory, not defeat, alignment. The kind that doesn't require noise to sustain it. The kind that holds steady long after the moment passes. You didn't fight, and that's why the conflict never took shape. There was a moment you didn't announce. You didn't even recognize it at first. Something reached for you. A look, a pause, a familiar cue asking for response. And nothing moved. Not resistance, not defiance, just no pull. That's when approval lost its weight. Not all at once, not dramatically. It slipped. Quietly enough that you only noticed later, when something that used to matter didn't register the same way. You didn't feel relieved. You didn't feel empowered. You felt neutral. And that neutrality changed everything. For a long time, validation had functioned like gravity. Subtle, constant. You adjusted your tone without realizing it, timed your silence, measured yourself against reactions that weren't yours to manage. Not because you were insecure, because you were attentive. But attentiveness becomes vulnerability when it's unreciprocated. You didn't stop caring overnight. You stopped checking, stopped scanning faces for confirmation, stopped replaying interactions to see how you landed. There was no declaration of independence, just a growing sense that external approval no longer provided information you needed. You already knew where you stood. That shift removed leverage others didn't know they were using. When approval matters, manipulation is subtle. It doesn't need force, it only needs implication, a withheld response, a raised eyebrow, a delay. Those signals used to register, then they didn't. You watched familiar dynamics fail quietly. Attempts to guide you through praise didn't land. Attempts to correct you through silence lost effect. Without the need for validation, there was nothing to adjust. You became unresponsive to pressure that depended on your participation. Not intentionally, structurally. You didn't harden. You didn't withdraw emotionally. You just stopped outsourcing your sense of alignment. And that came with a cost. Because when approval loses authority, connection changes shape. Some people drift without explanation. Some dynamics collapse from lack of tension. You felt the distance form. Not loneliness in the dramatic sense. Absence. The absence of mirrors you no longer needed. You noticed how quiet it became when you weren't waiting for a reaction, how spacious conversations felt when you weren't trying to be understood. That space wasn't comforting at first. It removed reference points you relied on without admitting it. You had to learn how to stand without reflection, to trust internal calibration, to accept that not being validated doesn't mean being wrong. That's a solitary adjustment. Not because others disappear, but because the internal dialogue changes. You stop asking questions that only existed to keep you aligned with expectation. You stop performing subtle corrections to maintain harmony. And in that stillness, you recognize how much energy was previously spent managing perception. You didn't reclaim that energy with excitement. You simply stopped spending it. That's when manipulation lost its entry point. You weren't resistant. You were unavailable. Unavailable to approval as currency. Unavailable to disapproval as threat. Not detached from people. Detached from their evaluations. And the world didn't collapse. Some relationships thinned. Some conversations ended sooner. But your internal position stabilized. You weren't waiting to be told who you were. You weren't measuring your stance against response. You were present without seeking confirmation. That's not empowerment in the loud sense. It's quieter than that. It's the moment you realize no one else is holding the key, and they haven't been for some time. You just hadn't noticed until now. You didn't become someone else. You reorganized. That distinction matters more than it sounds. What changed wasn't your nature, it was the structure holding it. You started noticing which reactions were automatic, which defenses activated before thought, which roles you stepped into out of habit rather than alignment. And one by one, they stopped fitting. Not because they were wrong, because they were no longer necessary. You didn't tear anything down. You disassembled, quietly, methodically. You removed responses that were built for older conditions, defenses designed for environments you no longer occupy, explanations meant for people who needed you smaller to understand you. Nothing dramatic happened on the surface, but internally, the layout changed. Impulse used to move first. Now it waits. Not suppressed, contained. You feel it rise, register, then settle back into place without demanding action. That's control, not rigidity. You didn't harden yourself against the world. You aligned yourself within it. Your decisions slowed, not because you hesitated, because fewer things qualified for response.
You stopped reacting to signals that weren't addressed to your core. Noise lost access. The old version of you was built for survival, quick responses, constant calibration, a readiness to adapt on demand. That version did its job, but it wasn't meant to last. What replaced it isn't louder, it's ordered. You can feel the difference in how you enter situations now. Less scanning, less preparation for impact, more presence. You're no longer bracing. That doesn't make you passive, it makes you efficient. You don't spend energy reinforcing boundaries that are already understood internally. You don't negotiate with impulses that don't align. The structure does the work for you. This is what people don't see. They look for visible change, for attitude, for distance. But the real shift is architectural. Weight distributed differently, pressure routed elsewhere. You no longer collapse inward when something presses on you. You hold, because what's holding you has been reinforced. Old triggers lost their pathways. Old defenses were rerouted, then retired. Not out of denial, out of irrelevance. You didn't heal by returning to who you were. You reorganized so you wouldn't need to. That's why going back isn't an option. Not because you refuse, because there's nothing there to return to. The internal layout no longer supports those movements. You can visit the memory of it, but you can't inhabit it. Your identity isn't defined by what you withstand anymore. It's defined by what you allow. And that allowance is precise, deliberate, quiet. You're not guarding yourself, you're structured. There's a difference. Guarding requires vigilance. Structure holds without effort. You don't explain this to anyone. You wouldn't know how. From the outside, you appear mostly unchanged, but internally, nothing is where it used to be. And that's why the change feels irreversible. Not because you decided it would be, because the system wouldn't function otherwise. You're not becoming. You've already been rearranged. And the order you're in now doesn't accommodate the past version of you. It simply doesn't fit anymore.
They didn't miss it. They were never looking for it. You left before the end existed in their frame of reference, before outcomes mattered, before resolution became visible. That's why it looked sudden to them. But for you, it was already finished. Long before anything changed on the surface, you had stepped out of the sequence. The reactions kept happening. The patterns repeated. The signals were sent. And you weren't there to receive them. They thought you were still inside the exchange, still negotiating, still calculating responses. They kept playing their part with precision, tone, timing, pressure. What they didn't notice was the absence of friction. Conflict needs resistance. It needs participation. It needs something to push against. You weren't pushing. You weren't pulling away either. You were simply no longer oriented toward the same objective. That's the part they never see coming. Not because you hid it, but because it doesn't announce itself. Disengagement doesn't make noise. It removes relevance. They escalated. You stayed still. They adjusted strategies. You didn't adjust at all. From their perspective, it felt unresolved, like something unfinished, like a conversation paused mid-sentence. From yours, there was nothing left to say. You weren't waiting for an outcome. You weren't positioning for advantage. You had already exited the structure that made outcomes meaningful. That's why nothing followed. No confrontation, no reversal, no visible shift of power. Just silence where reaction used to be. They interpreted that silence as delay, or weakness, or restraint. They assumed you would re-engage once the right lever was pulled. but the levers no longer connected to anything. You weren't withholding a response. There was no response to withhold. The system they were operating inside required mutual involvement. You weren't inside it anymore. That's not superiority, it's inevitability. Games only continue while all participants agree on the rules. You didn't change the rules, you stopped recognizing them. So the conflict dissolved without climax. Pressure collapsed inward. Momentum ran out on its own. From the outside, it looked like nothing happened. That's why they never saw the end coming. They were waiting for a moment, a reaction, a signal. The end wasn't an event, it was absence. And by the time they noticed it, there was nothing left to confront. Only the quiet realization that the exchange had ended without their consent. Not because you won, but because there was nothing left to engage with. And silence doesn't argue. You're not waiting anymore. Not for permission, not for a response, not for the moment when something finally feels settled. It already is. The urgency that used to live under your thoughts has gone quiet, not silenced, resolved. You don't feel the need to arrive loudly, or at all. You're already here. There was a time when movement felt necessary, when doing more felt safer than standing still, when proving something felt like the only way to keep your footing. That tension isn't here now. You notice how little effort it takes to remain exactly where you are, how nothing pulls at you the way it used to. How situations pass without asking you to step inside them. You don't announce this change. You don't reference it. You don't frame it as progress. You simply don't reach. Not forward, not backward. You hold your position without tightening around it. That's the difference. You're not guarding anything. You're not bracing. There's no internal rehearsal running in the background, no argument waiting to be delivered, no version of yourself being prepared in case someone demands it. You're not anticipating resistance, because resistance would require engagement. You've learned the weight of your presence doesn't come from pressure, it comes from consistency. You don't explain yourself into safety anymore. You don't negotiate clarity. You don't soften your stance to make it easier for others to stand near you. You let them decide, and you don't track the outcome. That's not detachment, it's alignment. You're no longer measuring yourself against reactions, no longer adjusting based on how something lands. You don't need agreement to remain steady. There's a quiet finality to this, not an ending, a closure that doesn't announce itself. You're not building toward anything. You're not escaping anything. You're existing on your own terms without needing to label what that means. Nothing about you is asking to be interpreted correctly. And nothing inside you is asking for confirmation. You understand now that authority doesn't assert itself, it settles. It becomes unmovable because it has nowhere else it needs to be. You don't lean forward when silence stretches. You don't fill space when it grows uncomfortable. You let the moment hold its shape. You're not withholding. You're complete. There's nothing left to prove. Not because you succeeded, but because proving was never the point. You didn't lose yourself. You kept what mattered. And now, without spectacle, without instruction, without noise, you remain. Still, present. you still hear